Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the Nonprofit Learning Lab for today's workshop. If you have any questions along the way for our presenter, you can type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel, likely on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have any tech questions, you can also type them there. If you're interested in using live captions for today's workshop, you can use the link we will send in the chat shortly. If you are interested in receiving the recordings and materials from today's free webinar, you can visit our free webinars page on the Nonprofit Learning Lab website, or you can send us an email at program@nonprofitlearninglab.org. And without further ado, I will now hand it over to you, Sharonda.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I am excited that you are here with us this morning to talk about building a culture of inclusion, creating a DEI strategy. And so I just want to thank you all again. If you have any questions or thoughts, feel free to put them in the chat. And I'm excited for our time today together. So just to briefly introduce myself, my background is in nonprofit management. I have been facilitating dialogues and working with companies and organizations for over 16 years when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I also served as a former executive director. And so when it comes to really thinking about how to, particularly in the nonprofit space, create spaces for thoughtful diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, something I'm really passionate about. So I'm excited that you all are here to really think about how to move that along within your organization. And so just to kick us off, I want to go over some of our learning objectives. And so a few things that I want you to think about in terms of takeaways for today. We want to be able to sort of define the differences between diversity, equity, and inclusion for the purpose of effective strategy. We want to understand how creating a DEI strategy can really promote belonging and inclusion within your organization. Share some components of an equity and inclusion strategy. Talk about what the phases of a DEI strategy look like. And then I want you to think about some next steps that you can take back within your organization, wherever you are in sort of this diversity, equity, and inclusion phase. So as we kick off, I'd be curious to know, at what stage is your organization in the DEI strategy process? And so we've got a poll that should be up for you now. So where is your organization? Are you in the exploratory phase where you're trying to really think about putting these pieces together? Are you beginning? You've maybe got a few things in place or have started to have some conversations, but you still know that there's quite a ways to go. Are you maybe in those final stages where you've got a DEI group, you've got affinity groups? Or are you now starting to maybe create a new phase, or you're starting to re-envision and reimagine the work that your organization has done? And so we'll keep this up just for a moment, and then we'll sort of see where we are as a group. Awesome. So it looks like we have quite a few people in the beginning stage or the intermediate stage. We've got a few in the exploratory stage. That's perfect. And truly, no matter where you are, because this work is evolving, there will always be new iterations and sort of refining the work that you all do. And so again, really excited to have you here and kind of talk about how to really make this an embedded practice in the work that you all are doing. So before we get started, I really feel like it's important as a best practice to define diversity, equity, and inclusion. I work with a lot of organizations, and one of the things I find is sometimes there is not a clear or standard definition within that agency around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And so some of you probably already know these definitions, but it's really important to sort of ground us for the purpose of conversation. And so I'll just take a moment and I will define some of these terms as we talk about our time together when we think about DEI. So diversity, it's the wide variety of shared and different personal and group characteristics among human beings. And so that includes race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation or attractionality, socioeconomic status, age, physical abilities, religious beliefs, political beliefs, or other ideologies. And so it's sort of this wide variety of these different social identities. And then equity. Equity is the fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for all people, while at the same time striving to identify and eliminate barriers that have prevented the full participation of some groups. And when we talk about inclusion and belonging, inclusion is this act of creating environments where individuals of any group can feel welcomed, respected, supported, and valued to fully participate. So, an inclusive and welcoming climate really embraces differences and it offers respect in words and actions for all individuals. In belonging. So belonging is sort of what I like to say, kind of the real heart of the purpose of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's really sort of this refined next phase when we talk about DEI. So belonging is the emotional state that's the goal of DE&I efforts. So your organization's inclusive processes are there to make everyone feel welcomed, for people to feel as if they truly belong and they're exactly where they are. So people should not have to consciously or unconsciously sort of check or hide parts of themselves when they're being a part of your community. And that could be clients, that could be your staff members. So individuals shouldn't have to, for instance, code switch, or if an individual has a disability, that shouldn't be something that they have to feel sort of shame or stigma around hiding when they're showing up to your organization. And so that's sort of that definition of belonging. And so I like to always share this with people because, again, when I work with organizations, sometimes there are varying definitions. And really, if you're trying to start off on the right foot, especially again, we've got a lot of folks here who are in the exploratory phase, the beginning phase, or those in the intermediate phase, you really want to have some clarity around what diversity, equity, inclusion means and what it's not. So when we talk about diversity, sometimes I'll hear people say, we need a diverse board member. We need a diverse person on our staff, an individual. So an individual person cannot be diverse, but organizations, teams, a group of individuals is diverse. So multiple identities being represented within an organization with various perspectives, ideas, and social identities, like we talked about race, gender, ethnicity. That's what diversity is. And that's really important when you think about equity and inclusion work, because if you're looking at an individual because they are a woman or they are a person of color or they're LGBTQIA identified, we can tokenize people. And that is inauthentic and really problematic. And so we have to understand having multiple people at the table is what we're talking about when we're talking about diversity. And then equity is really understanding this redistribution of power. And so equity is thinking about power, privilege, and access within your organization and how you can redistribute that. How not just a small group of people has power, but multiple voices are being able to be heard, respected, and have access. And then inclusion is not a natural consequence of diversity and equity efforts. And so just because you have people of multiple social identities and just because you're thinking about these different ways to redistribute power doesn't actually mean that people automatically feel as if they're included or that they belong. And so inclusion and belonging, again, it's about that quality of human experience. So not just the fact that they are in the organization, but are they invited to the table and do they actually have space to feel welcomed and have a voice at that table? So now that we have talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I just want to share for a brief moment this idea of two-dimensional diversity. And so Harvard did this study thinking about the different ways in which we can think about diversity and thinking about diversity as if there are actually sort of two different aspects of diversity. So again, religion, age, sexual orientation, attractionality, disability status. That is definitely the big part of diversity that we're talking about, because these are social identities that allow power and privilege and access in terms of the world that we live in. And those really need to be upheld. But we also want to think about this additional sort of enhanced aspect of acquired diversity. So, acquired diversity is thinking about a human being's lived experience. So, for instance, that might be that they were in the military. It might be that they speak multiple languages. It might be that they've had the opportunity to live in multiple spaces and understand different cultures. It might be generational savvy. So having people of multiple generations and having those individuals understand different generations, all of those things sort of enhance a human being's experience to be more culturally aware and um, cultural humility, as well as their social identities. And so the reason why I bring up two-dimensional diversity is because when this study was done, it showed that companies where there was two-dimensional diversity, they were able to exhibit um, more effectiveness in terms of the work that they did. There was more collaboration. And so when we think about the benefits of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, one, it is a good thing to do. And I think that there are quite a few people who feel that way. But in addition to, human beings looking at it as it is morally right to include and have all individuals feel as if they belong, there are some real benefits to how it can help and support an organization. So when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, teams tend to be more productive. Teams tend to be more, they have a better market share, so they tend to have more opportunities for different clients. Studies have shown when there is really the stronger emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so now I want to talk about for just a moment, what does diversity, equity, inclusion look like in terms of staff engagement? Because again, we're talking about really building a culture of belonging. So throughout this entire webinar, I really want to sort of hone in on this idea that throughout the entire phase of thinking about integrating diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're talking about engaging human beings. We're talking about enhancing culture and building stronger communities within your organizations throughout this entire process. And so here are a few statistics that I think are just important and interesting to think about when we talk about sort of employee engagement trends. So, increased job satisfaction. So, companies with diverse and inclusive cultures experience about 20% more employee satisfaction that leads to higher motivation and engagement among staff members. There also is stronger employee loyalty. So organizations that prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion are about 3.8 times higher in employee loyalty and retention. So individuals feel a greater sense of belonging when they feel like they can bring their whole selves. They feel a greater sense of commitment to the companies that value diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then there's enhanced productivity. So teams that work with a focus on being more inclusive are likely to be innovative. They're more likely to demonstrate higher levels of collaboration and innovation in comparison to their counterparts. And then again, we're reducing turnover rates. So companies that actively promote diversity, equity, inclusion experience 22% of a lower turnover rate, as employees are more likely to stay in an environment where they feel respected, valued, and included. Also, when we talk about sort of this new workforce, when we're talking about Gen Z and sort of the new budding workforce that we're having, and we think about intergenerational values, really for the individuals who are about to be in the workforce for the next 20, 30, 40 years, there are statistics that show there is a real emphasis on wanting to work with companies that have clear values, companies that are really authentic about their culture, in companies that are really trying to do very tangible, meaningful, authentic diversity, equity, inclusion efforts. And so when we talk about engagement and you're thinking about your team and how to sort of invest and keep people there, this is really important to people. And for those who you're kind of again emerging, or you're trying to get other individuals on board. I know sometimes there might be a handful of individuals that really see the purpose in this work, and there sometimes are others within the organization or in leadership who maybe don't understand. The reason I sometimes share these statistics, the reason why I talk about the importance of engagement, is because that's another way to start to get that stakeholder buy-in. And investment is really helping people understand the multiple ways in which diversity, equity, and inclusion can really be pivotal in supporting the growth and the sustainability of your organization. And so I want to talk for a moment about the components of a DEI strategy. And so I'd like to ask you all another question. So we just opened a poll up to you all. What percentage of companies have diversity, equity, and inclusion goals? So out of the companies and organizations that we have within the US, what percentage of them do you believe have diversity, equity, and inclusion goals? Is it 24%, 43%, 52%? Put that in the chat, and then we'll sort of share those results. Okay, so it looks like the majority of folks are saying about 24%. Then we've got folks saying 43%, and then the smaller number, 52%. And so, yes, for those of you who said 24%, 76% of companies do not have diversity, equity, or inclusion goals. Now, this is something really important to think about, because roughly 80% of companies then have no goals or strategy attached to equity and inclusion, or they may just sort of be going through the motions. And obviously, this is not the easiest work to do, but 80% of individuals are looking to be a part of a company where their values and where their emphasis on really having strong DEI efforts is there. And so if that's only happening for less than 25% of companies, there's a disconnect. And so what we're trying to do is sort of create some more synergy, and really start to kind of mitigate that disconnect between what staff and clients and human beings are asking for versus what's happening within an organization. So I want us to now think about sort of the components of a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. So we've talked a little bit about, how is it helpful for employee engagement and retention? We've talked about, thinking about how it can increase productivity, engagement within an organization. But I sort of want to share the parts of a DEI strategy. And before I sort of get into detail about all of these, there's one thing that I want to note that I'd love for people to think about. Sometimes I work with organizations, whether it's nonprofits, whether it's tech startups, whether it is municipalities, and they'll say, well, in our strategic plan, we have a diversity, equity, and inclusion bullet point. Or, we have a diversity, equity, and inclusion slogan. We are talking about how to create strategy and focus around diversity and equity and inclusion, same way you would think about a strategic plan. But we really want to think about how to integrate this in every aspect of the organization. So companies that are most successful when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, they're intentional, they're clear, they are flexible, but it's not contained to a bullet point or a box or a policy. It really is ingrained from hiring and retention, recruitment, culture, community building, strategic planning, finances, policies, and procedures. So every aspect of how your interacting and moving and within the body of your organization should be how you're thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so these are sort of the parts of if you could break down an effective DEI strategy, here are some things that I've seen over my time in working with organizations that are really helpful. So having a foundation and vision, creating some type of internal assessment, implementation, and then being committed to evolving in practice in thinking about the external impact of where your organization is and who's affected by your organization. So foundation and vision, internal assessment, implementation, and evolving practice. And so I'm going to spend a few moments and go over each of these components, and then we'll talk a little bit about sort of the steps of what that might take for those of you who are getting started. So first, we're going to talk about foundation and vision. So similar to your organization, where you have a mission statement and a vision statement, it's really important to have some clarity and some clarity in language around what is the purpose of your diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. A lot of times I found that organizations will come and they will say, we've been doing DEI work for a few years now, but it's not sustainable, or we're not getting a lot of participation, or we feel like we're sort of coming back in a circle, or we're not really sure where to land. And part of that is because there isn't a foundation and there isn't sort of a vision around the work that's happening. And so just like you would for your organization have a mission or vision statement, it's really helpful to have some language that starts to define where your organization lands when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this can evolve over time, but I really see it as a solid foundation in terms of getting DEI work started. So this is a question that I ask organizations all the time when I start working with them. And people can put in the chat if they have a response to these, or just take a moment and think about it for yourself. So here we are today. And if you're thinking about 3 years from now, and it is August 31st, what does your organization look like? So if your organization were really intentional about integrating DEI principles, what would be the impact within your organization? What would it look like for your colleagues, your clients, and your community? What would people say? How would people feel? What would leadership look like? What would your decision-making process look like? So just take a moment and think about that. Now, what I'd like you to do is hold some of those things in your mind. And when you go back and you talk with your colleagues, your board, other staff members, I want you to sort of share that question out, because it really is helpful for you to think about, if this is where we want to go, what do we need to do to get there? And so I want to share a few examples of some mission statements and some vision statements specifically around diversity, equity, and inclusion from different organizations. And so Bose Allen is one organization that I'll share an example from, Adobe, but this is actually from a school. And so this is from the Whitney M. Young School, and this is their statement around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I will just read this off for you all. So our mission is to intentionally foster diversity, equity, and inclusion in every action and branch of our school in order to provide an environment of excellence in which each student, teacher, staff, and community member is able to nurture self and group identities while cultivating empathy and respect for differences, promote critical thinking skills about bias, and foster courage to stand up against discrimination. What makes this statement good is not just because it is a statement around diversity, equity, and inclusion, but they're really clear about what their sphere of influence is, and that's their school. They're not saying that they're out to necessarily influence the entire world. And we hope that in our space that does trickle over and affect the broader community, but they're really clear about who they're trying to support. It's their school environment. And they're clear about the individuals they want to be impacted by their diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. That's students, teachers, staff, and community members. They're also really clear about some of the things that they want to have happen. They want to cultivate empathy. They want to cultivate respect. They want people within their community to be critically thinking about bias. They want them to think about ways to stand up for discrimination. So when you think about your diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, what is the heart of what you're trying to do? If you can start to identify and define that, that is going to help you when you think about the work that you do. And so I also will share their vision. So the group champions diversity, equity, and inclusion for key stakeholders, again, students, families, staff, teachers, administrators, community members, and again, supporting anti-bias education, professional development, equity in hiring, and involvement of parents and community. So again, I want you to think about who are you serving? You may be serving individuals who are experiencing housing instability. You may be an organization that is supporting individuals who maybe are neurodivergent. Maybe you're an arts and culture based organization. What is it that you do, and what would be the impact within your scope of work and sphere of influence when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion? And so I won't read this, but I'll just pull it up for a minute. So Adobe has sort of an initiative, or the way that they have framed their DEI within their organization is this concept of Adobe for all. And so this is sort of their statement when they think about what it looks like for individuals, whether it's clients or whether it's staff, to be able to have access to Adobe. And here, they actually have some key areas of focus, which I think are really nice. So they have this on their website so that people can look at it. But they're really focused on pipeline work, so building pipelines for future technical talent. They're focused on employees, so creating an inclusive workplace through community building, training, internal awareness, offering family-friendly benefits around policies such as paid parental leave, candidates. So thinking about recruitment, sourcing candidates from a variety of backgrounds, and ensuring fairness in our interview and hiring process, and then industry. Joining forces with our customers, partners, vendors, and peers to drive forward progress. So again, all of these organizations are making this work really relevant to them and to what they do. I've got, clients that I've worked with before, and, they've said, we're trying to end discrimination everywhere, or we're trying to stop a particular form of harassment or discrimination, which is great. I do think there should always be some visionary aspect to the work that you do, but you also have to think about how is it connected to the actual scope of work and the mission and vision and values that your organization already has that currently exist. And so I'll just pull this up really quickly, but I won't read it. And then all of you will always have copies to this slide deck, so you can sort of refer to this other example in more detail. But I do want to just share some foundation and vision tips. So it's really important to be clear and concise. Be clear about your values. Be clear about why equity and inclusion is important. Start with that bigger picture vision, because it gets people excited, it gets people engaged, and it can really set the foundation for how you all want to go. And then don't overly complicate it. So it is better to have something that is written that feels like it's clear, that you can go back to and evolve over time, instead of trying to wordsmith. And then consider again that future impact. Focus on what success would look like. And then you want to aim to invoke and inspire passion. And again, like I said before, similar to what you saw in these examples, keep it connected to your organization's values and your organization's mission. So if you do this, that's really going to help you all as you start to think about your diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Now, I'd like to talk about sort of this idea of having an internal assessment. So again, the first part or a really important part is having a vision, but then also what's important is having an internal assessment around your diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. A lot of times organizations will sort of be in this loop of we're doing a lot of projects and you feel like we're moving, but kind of in like that hamster wheel that can sometimes happen, right? And it's because there maybe hasn't been that visioning, but there also hasn't been sort of a climate check. So when I say internal assessment, have you done a climate check of what your specific equity and inclusion needs are? Because if you start there, one, it feels way more tangible. And two, you can give your community, your staff, your clients, the folks that you are connected with, your board and leadership, you can give people what they need when you know what your gaps are. And so a lot of you have probably done some form of SWOT analysis, if not for your organization, in some other aspect of life. But think about your strengths. Think about the things that your organization does really well. Think about what people come to you for. Think about your weaknesses. So what are your challenges that are unique to your organization? What are the areas of gaps? Where do you have fewer resources? Then think about those opportunities. What are you open to? What are the trends or funding opportunities that you can take advantage of? And how can you turn these strengths into bigger picture opportunities when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion? And then threats. What are those external things that maybe create barriers in the work that you're doing? Maybe it's the size of your building, maybe it's staffing capacity, but what are the things that maybe create some increased challenges to the meaningful work that you're on a day-to-day basis trying to do? So thinking through that lens helps you sort of think about where to start. And so I want to share some of the ways that you can start to do that temperature check and get information from individuals within your organization around your DEI needs. So one thing you might want to do is sort of that quantitative information gathering. Look through your organization's history. So think about your demographics, age, race, nation of origin, and start to really see, okay, it maybe seems as if we have a predominant group of people in this area, or we tend to be historically underrepresented with this social identity, just because it starts to give you an idea of, again, where those gaps may be or where your stress may be. And then start to think about equity data. So equity data might look like your performance reviews. It might look like who tends to have access to information and resources. Are your policies and procedures, are they only, printed somewhere and a few people can access them? Are they accessible for staff when they're, doing their work? But really start to think about equity. Think about programming and training. So think about doing pre and post surveys when you're doing training. Think about gathering information about people's experiences. And inclusion and belonging. Think about tenure. So how many people stay at your organization? What does your turnover rates look like? What are the trends among your departments? And then hiring, recruitment, and retention. Think about succession planning. How many employees are recruited from a specific organization, a specific program, or a specific school? All of that actually is connected to equity and inclusion. Think about your job description and the language that you're using, or even how your interview process is. All of those things can be thought through from a diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint. Now you can do that, and then you can also do some qualitative information gathering. So you could have dialogue with your staff. You could have one-on-one conversations. You can have focus groups. You can do interviews with your employees, asking people to talk about what their experience is. What are the gaps? What are the things that they feel really proud of about your organization? What, from their perspective, are the things you all do really well, in the things that may be challenging overall, but then in relation to thinking about belonging, thinking about equity, thinking about inclusion. And then so often we just do exit interviews when someone's leaving. If you can do those sort of stage interviews during someone's tenure and sort of asking them, why are they a part of the organization? What excites them? What would keep them there longer? That is going to help you get information to think about what people need in terms of coming up with a culture that is really thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so here are some things to consider as you start to do some information gathering. So again, that could be a climate survey, that could be some individual check-ins, that could be at your staff meeting, starting to have some opportunities and questions to get people thinking and brainstorming. But as you do all of that, have you created a secure environment for people to give feedback? Do you have safeguards for if people are sharing things that could be, uncomfortable or could be challenging, that they're able to do that without fear of repercussion, fear of being fired, fear of not being promoted? And then do you have partners and leaders across your organization? So do you have the investment for multiple individuals? And then being a good steward of that information. So if you're starting to ask your organization, hey, we really want to start doing some diversity, equity, and inclusion work, we want to hear back from you, and you do nothing with that information. You're not giving updates. You're not sharing sort of where you are in the process, or if you've gotten feedback before and you haven't used it, that can really affect morale. So you need to think about, as you're gathering information to sort of understand the gaps and the needs of your DEI efforts, that you're really being a good steward over this information. And so I won't read all of these, but I will share a few questions. And these are sort of equity related questions. So from a very simple level, if you don't have, a strategic plan, or you don't have some of these fleshed out things, when you have a team meeting, you can actually ask questions. And when you're doing a project review, you can ask questions that are related to equity. So for example, have you all, when you're about to make a decision, was everyone at the table that could have been at the table? Are there people who are missing that could have been a part of that conversation? That first question that I asked earlier, does your organization have a shared definition of DEI? Has the agency sought to center equity throughout aspects of your organization, recruitment, training, promotions? Does the organization actively support diverse suppliers and contractors? All of these are different questions that you can ask in terms of starting to do some assessment around where you are and sort of where your needs are in relation to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we've talked about starting to think about some visioning around your DEI work, some assessment, so doing sort of a climate check and a temperature gauge of where you are as an organization. But then we also want to think about implementation. And so when we talk about implementation, there are a few aspects of implementation that you need to think about. It's having stakeholder buy-in, it's having a team of diverse individuals and thought and experiences and social identities that can help with your DEI work. It's also thinking about how to assess and evaluate the work that you do and creating some SMART goals. And so when you think about your DEI work, you really want to think about it from a few different lenses. You want to think about your values and your vision. You want to think about trainings, so identifying learning gaps and creating or outsourcing quality professional development and training. Data, you want to use data to inform and influence your decision making, just like you would if you had a development strategy or you had something else in your organization. You want to do some research. So what are some best practices and what are community resources? There's a lot of really quality resources out there in relation to diversity, equity, inclusion, so you don't always have to reinvent the wheel. And then you want to implement at a level of consistency. So you want to set some priorities and be consistent in the support that you're offering to staff and stakeholders. And then that last sort of component of diversity, equity, and inclusion is you want to think about evolving practice and you want to think about external impact. And so when we talk about evolving practice, what I'm saying is you want to always think about how to grow. I had someone ask me just a few weeks ago, well, what if an organization says that we've done everything we can do for diversity, equity, and inclusion? I would say to that organization, that means you probably definitely have more work to do when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, because we are human beings. We're complex, we're multifaceted, and so are organizations, which means people don't stop being people, and organizations hopefully don't stop growing. So there should always be a commitment to evolving the work that you do. So for some of you who are maybe shifting to that sort of advanced phase in equity and inclusion work, you should be thinking about how to evolve and to go deeper in the work that you're doing. And one way to do that is have some clear and measurable goals. And so don't make it ambiguous. Can you pick 3 to 5 areas of focus over the next year where your organization is going to think about how to better integrate diversity, equity, inclusion? You want to use evidence-based research to support your work. So just like you would use evidence-based research if you are an organization that has a tech influence or you're a youth serving organization, you want to think about that when it comes to equity and inclusion. You want to create a space for collaboration and feedback. I know so often in the nonprofit space, we're so busy and we have so much to do, but time for reflection and really deep, thoughtful questions will help you think about where to go and how to advance and enhance the work that you're doing. And then again, you want to make it a part of your core culture. So DEI shouldn't be a side item. It should be integrated into all of the work that you do. And you want to be committed to consistent education, professional development, and communication, because that is going to give your employees opportunities to learn. Language changes, resources change, the work starts to evolve as we talk about equity and inclusion. So the same resources that you had 2 years ago, there will be different resources in the future. And so just being committed to making sure that you're up to date with those as well. And I also want to talk about your external impact. And so, external impact is thinking about your sphere of influence as an organization. Think about the city that your organization is located in. And you might be located in multiple cities. Think about the clients that you serve and the backgrounds that they're coming from, their challenges, their needs. Why are they engaging with your organization? All of these individuals in that space is a part of your external impact. And so that's sort of that last part of thinking about equity and inclusion is how is the work that you're doing affecting individuals who are outside of your space? So how are you reaching out and serving clients across social identities? Examine the diversity of your clientele. Are there reasons why people who maybe are public transit dependent are not able to always access your resources? Or do you have a community where there are individuals who English is not their first language? Are there ways to engage with them? And then you also want to develop authentic connections with your community. And so you shouldn't just be reaching out to another organization when you're maybe trying to hire people of, a specific ethnicity or identity. You want to create authentic connections and partnerships because that is a part of equity, inclusion, and belonging. And then what impact does your organization have on your clients and community? And that could be what are the intended and the unintended consequences of decisions that you're making. So that could be, is your building placed in a way where it's not accessible? Or are there things that have happened that maybe are causing harm to a particular community? You want to keep all of that in mind because that is part of the social responsibility of organizations that are saying they're committed to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And so we've talked about sort of these different components of a DEI strategy. I want to talk about sort of the phases or sort of the timeline component. So sort of part one, part two, part three in regards to a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. And so as you can see here, I like to think about DEI in terms of phases, almost as if there are 6 phases. So there's the phase where you're garnering support and you are trying to get stakeholders involved. You're trying to have people understand the importance of even thinking about equity and inclusion. Then you're doing some sort of internal needs assessment. So like we said, when we talked about doing, some type of climate assessment, that's sort of the second phase of the work that you're doing. And then there's the development. It's starting to put together what might some goals be, what might some areas of focus be for our organization. Maybe it's training, maybe it's getting people to understand language, maybe it's doing some unconscious and implicit bias training, but you want to start developing some thoughtful ideas, and then you want to do them. So there's that implementation part. And then after you've done your trainings or after you started to go, okay, we really need to think about our policies and procedures, you want to evaluate the work that you're doing, but you also want to have a thoughtful evaluation of the process. So how are you doing that work? So when we talk about strategy phases, and I'm sorry if it looks a little weird on this PDF when you all look at it in your version, it should look a little bit better than what I'm seeing right here. But the first thing that you want to do is you want to understand your stakeholders and you want to personalize diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so when people are getting on board with something that is new, or different or challenging, I do not want to undermine that this is not easy work. We don't often have these conversations. We're not often talking about differences. You want to have people have an understanding of how this can positively impact them. And so, really thinking about, again, making it relevant to your organization. I work with an organization of physicians, and what we've had to do is really help physicians understand how thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion makes you a better service provider to your patients. It actually decreases some of the health risk factors for your patient when you are a culturally humble care physician and you can ask them questions, understanding the biases or the fears that some communities have even around going to the doctor. Not every culture has had a great experience, or every identity group with healthcare in this country. And so for them, thinking about what are the benefits as physicians to even think about DEI. So that's something that you want to do. You also want to get a group of people of diverse social identities and backgrounds to move that work forward. And so thinking about, can you get a core group of people within your organization that are invested, but that will meet and talk with one another and come up with some really important ideas. And then those individuals can help come up with the questions to do your climate survey, to have those conversations with other staff around your gaps. And then to start, just pick 3 areas of focus maybe for your first year and set some really clear goals. It's okay to move in a fashion that isn't super fast. Sometimes when you move too fast, you miss something, but you also want to be accountable and you want to move in a way where work in progress is still happening. But there's got to be some organization when doing that. One way to think about that is, can you have quarterly or biannual feedback and opportunities for reflection around the work that you're doing? So maybe it's an annual climate survey. Maybe it is, a quarterly meeting with individuals around what that DEI work looks like. And so here are just a few tips for each of these phases that I'll just share sort of one for each of those. And in the next few minutes, we'll actually open it up to questions for you all. But that first phase, in terms of garnering support, like I just mentioned, you want to make sure that your stakeholders understand the importance and need of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Does your board understand and are they invested? Does your executive director understand the need and the importance? And it doesn't mean that they have to know everything about diversity, equity, inclusion, but do they see it as important? Because if you don't have particular leadership invested, it really can be harmful to the work that you're doing. So really thinking about, how do you get buy-in? How do you allow for feedback and effective communication just to get people bought into equity and inclusion, especially for those folks who are sort of in the beginning or exploratory phase. And then what you want to think about is, in terms of that needs assessment, think about client trends and opportunities. Think about your involvement within the community. You might want to use an equity needs assessment tool. Most of them that are out right now are for universities or schools, but I've done some work with municipalities and other nonprofits sort of crafting equity assessments to sort of help you figure out where you are, just like there are board assessments to kind of have you gauge, is your board sort of healthy and thriving, or is your board in the beginning phase of a big, a functioning board? There's some similar assessments around equity and inclusion as well. And then it's always okay, again, to get the support of a consultant or other people, but doing some sort of assessment. And then development. So again, creating those clear and actionable goals, deciding when you might need an external consultant or a university or someone to sort of help you figure out how to move that work forward and what the scope of that looks like. Sometimes it's really important and really needed to partner with individuals or other organizations and kind of get that feedback. And then implementation. So thinking about when you're implementing DEI work, being consistent with your trainings and developments, but also creating a communication plan for your employees and stakeholders. Just like we saw with Adobe for All, a lot of organizations also sort of have updates, whether it's on their site, whether it's in staff or team meetings around your equity and inclusion efforts, because it's going to help everyone feel like they're on board. Because again, it's about access to information as well. And then evaluation. So that could be those surveys, that could be, looking at demographics, but really thinking about just continuing to have best practice and looking at the bigger picture of the work that you have done. And so this is a sample timeline if you think about the year in the life of an organization that's thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it might be in the first few months of getting started, you're going to do that stakeholder investment. You're going to think about DEI as a strategic priority and how to embed that in your organization. You might participate in things where people are starting to learn about equity and inclusion, just like a webinar. And then sort of your second through your fourth month, you might be doing some climate surveying. And by the time you're at the 6 month mark, you're starting to maybe really create some actionable goals and some key areas of focus from the information that you've gathered. And then once you're at sort of that midpoint, that's when you might start having, some trainings. You might have the people that you've gathered to really help. There may be creating a plan for what does it look like over the next few years for us to grow and be accountable to our equity and inclusion efforts. And then, for instance, maybe you're at the fall, or maybe you're at that sort of, 9 to 10 month process. You're doing some surveying and you're creating opportunities for feedback loops around your equity and inclusion efforts. Maybe your DEI working group is now a committee, or it's now a task force that has presented to the board some of these key areas of focus so it can be more embedded in your policies. And then as you start to grow in the work, you're going to look at how you can get feedback and solicit from your clients around how you can do your work better. And so I just want to kind of share these tips to kind of wrap us up in terms of sort of a strong and sustainable DEI practice. You want to create those goals, you want to have that vision, you want to really think about culture, and again, you want to be committed to that work in a way that is holistic and evolving. And so I know I've thrown a lot at you in the last 50 minutes, but I do encourage you, one, to all download this PDF, and then also to sort of look at the resources, and we'll open it up for questions in just a moment. But Racial Equity Tools has a great glossary of terms. There are examples that are in that resource sheet around equity and inclusion statements. And then there is the Meyer DEI Spectrum Tool. There's a Seattle Racial Equity Toolkit. And so those are some really great resources in terms of even thinking about just how to get started with the work that you're doing. There's also a toolkit around accessibility and asking questions within your organization around how to be more accessible. And so I hope that this helps. And for our last few minutes, we'll just open it up to comments, questions, or things that people might have.
Thank you, Sharonda. We do have a couple questions so far. Our first one is, how do you collect data on your staff while respecting people's privacy and comfort for sharing their personal information? If you're trying to collect information to see what the data shows about your org, but data can be skewed if it's optional for people to respond.
I think that's an excellent question. So thank you for whoever said that. You've got to think about the comfort level of where your agency is. So if there is a space where people maybe don't trust, or like you said, they don't feel that comfort level, maybe start with some of those bigger picture questions. So start with asking people around what are areas of growth when it comes to thinking about social identities. Do you feel as if your social identities are respected within our organization? And so starting to kind of ask those questions is a way before you maybe get some of that demographic information. But I do think it's really helpful to ask people to self-select, and at least it'll give you a starting point. And then as you build a culture where people are more comfortable having those conversations, then you can collect more of that bigger picture data. but also helping people understand the reason why you're doing this is because you recognize that your agency is trying to grow and evolve. You're not just doing it so that you can put it on your website or so that there's any malintent. So I think trust building, I think maybe starting with some of those questions, I think allowing people to opt in are some really helpful ways to start.
Thank you. And our second question is, our leadership and our board have different ideas for our DEI strategy. What can we do to help everyone get on the same page?
I think I would go back to that bigger picture question, sort of what do you see as the impact for clients, staff, leadership, and the community. And it could be a separate or joint sort of time together where the board and staff start to flush those things out. And then I think you have some really honest conversations about what may be the disconnect. Or it could also be sort of a timing thing. I find sometimes because board members, and I say this as someone who chairs a board, because you're not connected to the day to day operations, sometimes there's a disconnect. So two things can happen. The board can have goals that are around bigger picture organization sustainability, just like leadership can have goals around sort of programming, staff support, and development. So it could be naming that there may be some differences in goals, but I think that it's having some clear definitions around DEI and really helping whether it's board or leadership understand that you need to have a purpose and a culture around DEI and not just project based. I tend to find that boards or folks who are a little bit more removed want to see projects and activities happen really quickly. And they're not sort of understanding that some of that foundational understanding, the temperature gauging, the information data is really important. And so if you're getting some resistance that way, I would really share that this is a culture shift. And so you're not just trying to do activities and projects, and that if you don't do it in a way that's really thoughtful, you'll kind of be back in the same position. So that conversation is some of the tips that I've encouraged leadership to have when there's a little bit of that disconnect between board and staff.
Thank you. Our next question is, how do we maneuver around our staff being the majority of one gender that typically does not share feedback or feelings?
So I think that part of it is, are there simple ways in which people can have opportunities for feedback and opportunities to receive feedback. So sometimes people go, well, staff don't share, they're not talking. When you're having team meetings, it could be that you're really starting just kind of on a culture community building standpoint, where you're asking people to share one or two reflections about a project. Or when you're having individual check ins, encouraging your managers and your directors to ask staff, what's something you're feeling really proud of? What's something that might be a challenge for you? So being proactive about creating a culture where feedback, sharing sort of how you feel or what you're thinking within an agency is consistent. And so not just asking people when it's a bigger picture, okay, what's the thing we need to talk about most when it comes to race? Everybody share their thoughts. If people don't feel comfortable sharing, oh, I'm stressed about this project on Tuesday, they're not going to share some of that bigger picture, more vulnerable content. So starting small and making it in your team meetings and your all staff trainings and your check-ins with staff more frequent, giving people that opportunity for feedback and reinforcing that it is safe for people to do so, that they won't be looked down upon, they won't be judged. Some of that information will be confidential, that it won't threaten the work that they're doing, is a way to start that. And to sort of name that we're, as a culture, trying to be more open and authentic for the purpose of everyone having a quality experience.
Thank you. And our next question is, MRCF provides services for K through 5 for our backpack program. The demographics we assist is actually consumers under another nonprofit's umbrella, and we assist as a funder. How do we work with that nonprofit in creating DEI for their consumers?
I think that being really honest with that organization and understanding your positionality as a funder. So instead of going in and saying, okay, we're about to right now in the next 3 months do DEI, I think it's having some listening sessions with organizations that you are funding, asking them what their needs are, asking them, what's the feedback that they're getting from their consumers, and then starting to share some of the resources that are in this webinar, some of the resources that you may have locally with them, but it's partnering with them to sort of guide them through maybe what that work and a plan could look like, but it's not micromanaging, and being really understanding that they know their organization maybe differently from you. And so I think that just having that posture is really helpful and really important. And then the other thing I will say is making sure that your organization, as the funder, is setting some tangible examples so that you can model that. So I always say, for a board or for a fiduciary organization, do you have DEI efforts? Are you living those out? Is the community seeing that you're living out your values when it comes to equity and inclusion? So making sure that that's happening in house for you all, even as you're going in and trying to support these organizations. But I'd start with listening, asking really clear questions, sharing resources, helping them understand their scope and capacity, and where you can come in and maybe provide some resources around their capacity with the DEI effort. Sharing this webinar, I think, is also something that can help, but giving people some learning tools as well for that organization.
All right, well, thank you, Sharonda. It looks like those are all of our questions at this time.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'm so excited that you all were here. My contact information is here. I'm always happy to, if people send emails and have questions or thoughts or ideas, I'm always happy to thought partner or send over a resource, even if it's not, a super structured partnership. I'm happy to be connected to organizations that are committed to doing really good work. So thank you all for participating and for coming.
Thank you, Sharonda. This workshop has come to a close. If you are interested in receiving the recordings and materials from today's free webinar, you can visit our free webinars page on the Nonprofit Learning Lab website, or you can send us an email at program@nonprofitlearninglab.org. Thank you so much for participating, and again, thank you, Sharonda, for educating our community.